There's a new podcast in the description. I spoke on the Toronto Raptors promoting Nick Nurse to their head coach position, and then I talked about seasons 3 and 4 of Game of Thrones. We're going to talk about Michael Porter Jr., a player who's been kind of all over the place throughout the entire draft process. A lot of it because the dude was injured for most of his college year. And as a result, teams were not able to really see him, but they still see the size and the shooting ability, and they see a guy who can put up a lot of points, right? But now we have a couple of news stories, really. One being that he's actually rising on draft boards, and a team like the Sacramento Kings at number 2 could even entertain the idea of selecting him. But then there's also reports of he had to cancel a workout because of some back problems, but still teams are really up on this guy. And I'll say now, after recording this entire commentary and coming back to this, my speculation as to why NBA teams are moving up on Porter, it comes at the end of the video. I guess I'll just do the TLDR right now. I think there's a lot of unknown with some of the top players in the draft, like Doncic and Bagley and Porter himself, right? But I think when you dive into what you can guarantee from all these players, Porter's shooting may be the safest bet out of all of these things, which is why some NBA teams may be so hyped on Porter amongst, his injuries and everything. There's definitely some different directions to go in here. I'm just going to start with Porter as a player. To me, he's going to be able to put up about 16 to 17 points without really doing anything, because the dude's 6'10", nearly 6'11", and he could get up there. I mean, I don't know if he's done totally growing yet. And he's just a hell of a shooter. So he can be in a system where maybe there's a point guard or a ball handler who can make plays to get him some open shots. He can spot up. He can move off ball. He can cut to the basket effectively just because of that size, so he could finish well over people. He's also a pretty decent athlete, so that's going to help him out as well. Transition, he can pull up for threes. He can also just be a good finisher in transition as well because of that size and athleticism. And then his ability to hit contested shots, right? A good example of this is in the playoffs, Kevin Durant would be defended by Jrue Holiday, who's a hell of a defender, and it didn't matter because the height difference was so drastic. Could see a similar thing for Michael Porter Jr. in the NBA, right? Another thing that's interesting with him is that he could play the power forward position. Well, maybe. His rebounding has to improve, and we have to know if he can really handle that physically. It may not come from his first season or even his second season, but maybe eventually he'd get there. But if you could play him at the power forward position the way that, the Clippers will with Tobias Harris, or the way the Pistons did with Tobias Harris, or even someone like Kelly Oubre Jr. on the Wizards, who's not going to be as good as Michael Porter Jr., that has a lot of effect. And, I mean, let's say he did get drafted by the Kings, who there's real rumors that they would do it, right? If you had, let's say, Buddy Hield at 2, Bogdan at small forward, and then Michael Porter Jr. at power forward, that'd be a lot of shooting. And it would help out De'Aaron Fox a lot. So I could see the rationale in the Kings doing that. I mean, I still like Doncic a lot, and it seems that he is falling a bit here, but I think MPJ would be an option, definitely. But I don't think, if I can move on, I guess, I don't think Michael Porter Jr. is a home run. One, there is still the injury scare, right? And you have to ask yourself, well, are you willing to take a guy who there could be some risks or there might not be any risks at all, versus someone, let's say like Jaren Jackson Jr., who from a health perspective has been totally fine. So that's a risk. But then when you get to some of Porter's weaknesses, I mentioned the rebounding already. That could be a thing if you want to play the power forward position with him, which I'm going to assume a lot of teams would want to do, you know? But then there's also his ball handling, which just needs to get better. That doesn't mean he doesn't have any moves in his arsenal, but could he get to, let's say, Kevin Durant levels where, like KD, I wouldn't even consider KD to be a very good ball handler. He's able to get by guys because it's good enough, combined with the fact that you have to stay glued to him because of how good of a shooter he is, and because he is just such a long body that he can just kind of get through you, I guess. Or you can't just like reach around him and get the ball. But even so, like you see with KD's handle that it's not the tightest handle in the world, right? But he's still able to be effective with it. As long as Michael Porter Jr. could get to that level, then that could be about all you can ask for with him. I do think once you get past a certain height, it becomes kind of difficult to be a really good ball handler because the ball it has so far to travel from the court back to your hand where you're never going to be someone like a Kyrie, but you can still be good. And if Porter can get to that point, then he can create more of his own offense, and that'll make him better, it'll make his teammates a little better, and that's all good stuff. I do think with him, though, the team that he ends up on may be a bigger deal than some other guys in this draft because a lot of scouts say that he does have moments of like inefficient style where he will maybe over dribble or take some bad 2-pointers. And before we go too crazy there, that was a criticism of Jason Tatum, and he hasn't done that almost at all in the NBA, you know? And it should also be said that Porter's such a good 3-point shooter that he may never end up taking long twos in the NBA. But it is still a concern with him nonetheless, right? And depending on the team he would end up on, we could see that become more of a thing or less of a thing. I mean, if he ended up on, let's say he fell to the Grizzlies at number 4, right? And I've talked about him going to the Grizzlies before. I think it would be a really good fit, and I think they could use him a lot. I feel like that would be a good place for him because Mike Conley would still have the majority of the ball handling, and Marc Gasol would probably still be the second most used guy on the team, right? So as a result, Porter would be kind of forced to just focus on shooting and playing off of those two, and he would get some ball handling opportunities, sure, but because he would just be flowing within the offense so much, I feel like he would get himself some better looks that way, and he wouldn't fall into some of the bad habits of his, just like taking bad shots and all that. I even think if he fell to the Chicago Bulls, which, with all these rumors, seems like it's not going to happen now, but I think Chris Dunn is a smart point guard. I don't think he's overtly talented, but he seems like he knows what he's doing out there, which could help Porter Jr. out a lot. However, if he fell to number 3, as I get my Dennis Schroeder hate on some more, then he could have some problems because Schroeder isn't really a point guard who can lead an offense like that, at least with the talent he's been given, in terms of like just his natural playmaking abilities. And if that's the case, then Porter Jr. might have to take on more ball handling, or he actually might not even get the ball enough, to be honest. And that, of course, does not sound like an ideal situation for him. But to be nice to Dennis, maybe with a legit shooter next to him, and Taurean Prince, I should say that, with those two, then, hey, maybe that would allow him to make some more plays and be a more efficient point guard. I mean, I'm not going to act like the team around him has been that good, so there's some wiggle room there. I actually think that De'Aaron Fox, if he were to go number 2, Porter, I like De'Aaron Fox. I think the jumper is going to hold him back probably his whole career, but in terms of knowing how to run a team, I think he showed some good signs in his first season. And then, to mention it again, just all the shooting that team could have if they selected Michael Porter Jr., I like that one. So I do think, depending on the team he goes to, we could see him take more long twos or take more three-pointers and be totally fine. And luckily for him, there's teams with a lot of good point guards at the top of the draft, you know? Like, sure, I don't love Schroeder, but I mean, between De'Aaron Fox and Mike Conley and Dennis Smith Jr., and, well, if he goes to the Magic, then that could be some trouble too, but then you're looking at Chris Dunn again, so he could end up being okay. And his playmaking and ball handling could improve to the point where the point guard next to him, while it would still help to have a good one, it won't kill you if you have one that's not as good of a playmaker. So, I like Michael Porter Jr. I do still like probably Ayton, Doncic, and we'll say like Jaren Jackson a little bit more. But, I mean, the draft is still kind of a crapshoot. So, if I end up being wrong, and this dude's like the best player in this draft in 5 years, them's the breaks. And it is still really interesting just how much shuffling is going around with him right now. Maybe this is teams not being totally in love with Doncic. I mean, part of it is definitely that. And I think they see that Porter Jr. can just be this guaranteed scoring, right? In a time where having small ball fours is just a really good thing. And yeah, there's some defensive fear with Porter, but if you can just get him to being not bad on defense and then he can give you the offense and you can put him at power forward, that's just really valuable in today's NBA, you know? And given that I said already that there are teams at the top of the draft that have good point guards, maybe they just see Porter's ability to play off of those points as more valuable than Doncic having the ball in his hands a lot. I guess it's possible. I guess it could also be a thing that they see Marvin Bagley's upside, but they also see the potential for him being a little disappointing outside of his athleticism. That could scare some teams off. I mean, you could make the argument that between Michael Porter Jr.'s shooting, Luka Doncic's ability to get by NBA defenders, and Marvin Bagley just figuring it out on either side of the floor, of those three things, Michael Porter Jr.'s shooting is probably the biggest guarantee, because shooting just translates, you know? It's not like you're going to be a great shooter and a great free throw shooter, and then you come into the NBA and suddenly you can't make shots, you know? I remember Brandon Ingram, he was making threes in college, but his free throw shooting was never there. So you could kind of already see it, you know? Whereas with Porter, just seems like more of a guarantee. So maybe that's what NBA teams see. I don't totally know. I'm not in these meetings, of course, but all I can do is speculate. But I think that'll do it. Michael Porter Jr., new podcast once again. Nick Nurse to the Raptors. Seasons 3 and 4, Game of Thrones. I'm nearly already done with Season 5. And that'll do it.